Chapter 34. Eiji thought he was doing an excellent job of looking normal. However, as soon as Norio saw him, he set down the jar he was carrying and rushed over. "Oh gods, Eiji, are you all right?" the smaller man cried, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Are you sick?" No. Gods, why was he stammering? "You look awful," Norio said, eyes round. Rokuro bustled up, indignant. "Norio, don't be mean. Oh, you really do look awful." Eiji wanted to speak, but his lip was beginning to wobble dangerously at the sight of their concerned faces, and he didn't trust his voice to stay steady. "Oh no!" Rokuro's eyes widened. "Come on, sit down." Deliveries," Eiji protested weakly, but his throat was thick and his eyes burned even as he tried to pull away. "Zenji will figure something out." Rokuro put a burly arm around his shoulder and swept him towards the baking station. "Come on, we'll find you something to eat." "What happened?" Norio pressed, darting around them in a kind of jumpy dance as they moved through the galley. "Come on, Eiji, tell us." "He doesn't have to," Rokuro chided. "Sit here." Eiji obediently settled onto the pro-offered barrel, but as soon as he did, his eyes were drawn inexorably to the counter where he and Lord Felix had made the bread. The spot on the floor where they'd sat together, the place where he'd leaned as they kissed for the first time. "Now look what you did!" Norio cried indignantly as Eiji burst into helpless tears. "He didn't want to sit down and you made him cry! Eiji never cries!" "That shows what you know," Eiji thought as he dashed at the flood of tears in consternation. "I cry all the time now." Rokuro sounded frantic. "I'm sorry. Can I bring you something? How about soup? Do you want soup? I'll get soup." Eiji could only shake his head and hunch his shoulders, longing to disappear. He didn't deserve to cry about this. He most certainly didn't deserve their kindness, and once they knew what had happened, they would be angry that he had manipulated them with his misery into giving it. "I'm a bad slave. I'm a bad friend. Bad, all through." "What's going on here?" Zenji's strident voice was accompanied by firm footsteps. When he spoke again, though, he sounded immediately exhausted. "Oh, gods, what's wrong? Norio, what did you do to him?" Norio gave an affronted squawk. "I didn't do anything! It was Rokuro who made him sit down!" "Come on." A hand patted Eiji's shoulder, making him flinch. "Let's get you in my office where you can have some privacy." Eiji knew he should have felt ashamed as he trailed after the older man. He could feel the attention of all the kitchen workers like a dozen physical touches brushing over him. Ordinarily, he would have been mortified to lose control like this in public, but today he simply couldn't bring himself to care. He'd lain awake all night, obsessing over what had happened and making torturous, endless lists of everything he could have done better. First off, of course, he could have kept from saying his former master's name. He longed to go back, somehow, to strike out the moment when that word crossed his lips and learn what would have happened next if he could have been good and earned an explanation of what Lord Felix meant when he said, "I love you." That was first on every list, but they never stopped there. 2. He could have never have insisted on taking meals to Lord Antony's rooms in the first place. The new attendant clearly didn't need any help from the likes of him. 3. He could have accepted what he'd seen gracefully, recognizing that none of the gods owed him an accounting of what they did with their own property. 4. He could have been obedient and used Zenji's words earlier, on a day when his head wasn't full of his old master and he wasn't liable to make such awful mistakes. 5. He could have kept his attention on the god, as was proper, instead of getting so caught up in his own pleasure and rushed to orgasm. And on it went. He had castigated himself and wept interminably until morning. When he heard the bells warning that the sun had risen, he kept hiding behind the curtain his master had so generously granted him. He'd been terrified that Lord Felix might still be in the sitting room, that he might be forced to see him and speak to him. The thought was so horrifying, he'd considered hiding in the bed all day long just to avoid even the faintest chance of an encounter. And when he'd finally emerged and found the room empty, he'd been so disappointed he'd almost started crying all over again. Not entirely empty, however. There had been a note waiting on the table. He'd rushed over with unseemly haste, hands trembling as he picked it up and a wild, nameless hope thundering through his body. Dear Eiji, I'll see you this evening. Please try not to worry too much. I hope you have a lovely day. Felix. Eiji had appreciated the gesture, but the brief, cautious tone of the missive was so different from the effusive notes he still had hidden in the poetry book in his room that it was almost worse than not getting a note at all. The Eiji of 2 months ago would never have believed that one day he would be devastated because his master didn't sign himself yours. Gods, he was such a fool! And since he was exhausted and a wretched fool, it didn't matter who saw him weeping and miserable as he followed Zenji to his office. The humiliation even felt good in some obscure way, like a welcome distraction from his other sources of unhappiness. Let them stare. I'm the biggest failure of an attendant there's ever been. I deserve to be gawked at. I should be paraded around the temple as an example to the boys in training. That's Eiji. Make sure you don't grow up to be anything like him. Zenji closed the door firmly behind them, then gestured Eiji to the chair in front of his desk. It took more of an effort than usual for Eiji to sit properly instead of flopping down indiscoriously and slumping over the chair once he was down. He began, but lost the rest of whatever he'd been about to say in a hiccuping sob. Easy, boy, Zenji soothed. You don't have to talk. Just take a minute. The kindness stuck in Eiji's throat because he knew it couldn't last. As soon as Zenji found out what he'd done, he would be disgusted with him. Would he even let him work in the galley anymore? I'm sorry, he blubbered, but Zenji just patted his shoulder. Don't worry about it. Do you think you're the first to use the office this way? Or the first this week? Just relax. Eiji sniffled and cried for a few more minutes, but eventually he ran out of tears, and there was nothing left with which to postpone the inevitable conversation. He was reminded, horrifically, of the previous night and the moment when he'd huddled naked in Lord Felix's lap, casting desperately about for something to say that would make the situation better. Do you want to talk about it? Zenji asked at last. Eiji shook his head. It would only last for so long, of course, but he would grasp greedily at every scrap of kindness he could for as long as he could. He would need the soft memories to help him endure the coming days. That's all right. The older man returned to his papers. No hurry. They sat quietly for another long moment. Comfort turned to awkwardness, and Eiji was just about to meekly request a return to work when Zenji spoke again. It was generous of you to try to befriend that new boy, and I certainly understand why you did it. He seems very sweet. Maybe we can ask Norio to take him under his wing. The statement was so unexpected that Eiji could only blink his sore eyes at the older man for a moment. What? Zenji blinked back. I'm sorry. I was assuming things. Lord Antony's boy was asking about you when Norio delivered his breakfast. I assumed that was the trouble, that he was clinging to you a little aggressively, and it was too upsetting to hear about his situation that's just like yours was. The loneliness, the disappointment, all that. I know you've been happier with Felix, but it's still very fresh for you, and... The older man's voice trailed off. Something in Eji's face must be giving him away. God, since when had he had so little control over his face? He's not lonely and disappointed, he burst out, shocked to find how sharp yesterday's first blow still felt. Lord Antony is going to keep him! Zenji's face stayed blank and confused. Yes? Forever! Eiji felt a stab of guilty satisfaction when he saw the older man's face pale. What? That isn't... He never... Zenji shook his head as if to clear it. How do you know? When I went there yesterday, they were celebrating the decision. Eiji was suddenly desperate to spill every detail, knowing that only Zenji would be able to understand how viscerally wrong the scene had been. The boy was calling Lord Antony by name, and he had picked him up right off his feet, and was hugging him and spinning him. Zenji looked suitably stricken, his eyes turning wide and glazed. Eiji knew he was concocting the image in his head and finding it just as unbelievable as the real sight had been. No, the older man said at last, a desperate denial rather than an actual argument. That's not... No! They sat for a moment, the silence now holding a stunned edge. Zenji didn't even try to go back to his papers. He just held very still and stared at his desk as though he were trying to see through it and the floor and the lower decks all the way to the deep black sea below. I don't understand, Zenji said at last. There was a helpless, pleading note in his voice that made him sound young in a way Eiji would never have guessed possible. How? I don't know, Eiji whispered. I suppose he just did something right. Zenji flinched as though he'd been struck. Eiji half wished he hadn't said anything at all, but what would that have helped? Neither of them could avoid coming to the same conclusion. The barely trained blonde boy was simply better than they had been, and that was all there was to it. Why didn't you say anything yesterday? Zenji asked at last. You were acting happy. Did you at least talk to Felix about it? There it was, the moment Eiji had known was coming. He felt his shoulders slump under the weight of what he had to tell. Proper posture and deportment wouldn't help him now. Not exactly, he whispered, unable to meet the other man's gaze. I used your words. Used my words? Zenji asked. Then, oh. Eiji pushed ahead, feeling strangely defiant and eager to have it all out. It worked. My lord used me, but then I said Lord Antony's name, and it displeased him very much. I'm almost certain my master was about to cry, but he wouldn't let himself, and now he won't kiss me anymore, and I think I ruined everything. I understand if you hate me now, but that's what I did, and you might as well know. Oh, Eiji. Zenji's voice was so tender it brought a fresh flood of tears to sting his raw eyes. You've had a bad couple of days, haven't you? Eiji could only nod helplessly. It might all be his fault, and due to his own myriad inadequacies, but it had also been so bad. Of course I don't hate you, Zenji chided, patting his hand, and Eiji felt some of the tightly coiled muscles in his neck relax. What a thing to suggest, and I don't blame you either. I don't even want to think what I might have done if I'd seen that. But he's your friend, Eiji protested, unsure why he was arguing the mercy he'd been extended. So are you, the older man said gently. Anyhow, what would getting angry help? You're both likely to scold yourselves better than I possibly could. You poor bastards. What a mess. I hope Felix was kind about it. Eiji groaned. Of course he was. My lord was horribly, unbearably kind, as he always is. I almost wish he would get angry with me instead of always turning it in on himself. No, Senji shook his head. It's not safe to have one of them angry at you. I know it sounds heartless, but it's always better to have them blame themselves instead. Even Felix. That was so callous that it stole Eji's breath. Senji was Lord Felix's friend. He couldn't possibly wish pain on such a kind, generous god. How could anybody? It was clear that Lord Felix, out of every god and mortal on the ship, deserved to be happy. Eiji tried to control his expression, but he suspected that the corners of his mouth were tilting down. But my lord didn't do anything wrong, he snapped. There was no reason for him to feel guilty. He was incredibly good to me, as he has always been. Oh, gods, Senji sighed. You two are utterly gone for one another, aren't you? Eiji shook his head, stubborn. I displeased my master. I showed myself to be utterly unworthy of his ownership. Because of a single slip of your tongue? Don't be ridiculous. My lord seems to feel that I had been dishonest, muttered Eiji. And he thinks that he forced me somehow. It felt ridiculous and blasphemous to even utter the words. Eiji would never in 100 years be so ill-mannered as to make his master force him into anything, especially not sexual service. But Lord Felix's words had been impossible to misunderstand. Anyhow, Eiji could hardly dispute the god's point. He had not followed his master's wishes and had made Lord Felix ask him again and again before complying. That repeated stating of his desires wasn't what Eiji would consider force. Indeed, he doubted whether any other slave had ever been so gently prompted to render the submission he owed his master. Still, the facts remained. Eiji had known what the god wanted and had been rebellious, and Lord Felix had made it clear that he'd known all along. I haven't been properly obedient, he whispered, staring down at his knees and wilting a little with the force of his shame. The older man's answer was brisk. Obedience is the least of your issues, Eiji. Felix is not listening to you. I won't comment on whether what you did last night was right or wrong, but the person who has been making himself insufficiently clear here is not you. I'll have a word with him. Oh no. Please don't, Eiji cried. I shouldn't. My lord has already been more generous than I deserved by keeping me after I displeased him like this. I should never have gone around running my mouth about my master's business. I have no right to complain about any way he chooses to discipline me. Even if I would have chosen any other punishment the temple ever gave, rather than losing his kisses. Senji regarded him with tightly pursed lips, but finally nodded. I won't seek him out, he promised. If Felix asks me directly, though, I'll give him my honest advice. Eiji nodded in return. Thank you, my Senji. It's more than I deserve. I hope that's just temple talk, Senji said softly. I hope you don't really believe it. If it makes me this sad to hear you saying that, I can't imagine how it must feel for Felix. I know he's being thick right now, but try to give the poor man a bit of a break, Eiji. Don't make him listen to the man he loves putting himself down all the time. The man he loves. Another time, Eiji might have heard that staggeringly improper moniker and argued with Senji about it while a secret, hopeful spark glowed deep in his belly. Now it just hurt. My lord has revoked my courtship privileges, he reminded Zenji, stomach clenching around a knot of pain like a stone. No more kissing. And if anything, I imagine he's a worse wreck about that than you are, said the older man. If I didn't know that Hayato would be looking after him today, I would go and offer him my own shoulder to cry on as soon as our work was done. Eji's heart sped up hopefully. Does that mean I can still work my shift? Of course you can, Zenji said, reaching across the desk and nearly knocking over a pile of papers as he patted Eji's shoulder. But if you need to go home and get some sleep, just tell me, and I'll let you off for the rest of the day. Thank you, Eiji bowed in his seat. That's very generous of you. The older man scoffed. Don't go slinging that word around. You'll ruin my reputation. Now, you'd better figure out what you're going to tell Norio and Rokuro, because they will make your life a living hell until you give them something. Zenji is very kind, Eiji reflected as he emerged from the office and saw the baker and his cadre mates staring anxiously over at him. But he's also wrong. Everything felt much less hellish than it had before he stepped into the kitchens.